When I was 10 years old, I had the most vivid nightmare of my life to date. I was at the top of the stairs, saying goodbye to my parents, when I sensed something behind me. I turned and saw a huge black shadow figure standing over me. No matter how hard I looked at it, I simply couldn't see a face. I remember calling for my brother, who used to babysit me at the time, and no one came. The figure started to raise its arm over me, and I knew it meant me harm. I screamed out for my brother, and woke up in a cold sweat. I've never in my life been so frightened by something I assumed was inside my own head, but I took some comfort in the fact that it was only a dream. Sometime later, around Christmas time 2003, I recall coming downstairs around 11 to fetch my glass of water. I passed the living room, the door was open, and being a kid, I always stopped to take a glance at the Christmas tree. The room was empty. My parents were upstairs in bed, and I could hear my brother in his room playing video games. I continued to the kitchen and got a drink, and headed back up the hall. Again, I stopped to peek at the Christmas tree through the living room door. In the chair by the window, I saw someone sitting there. A tall figure that was completely cast in shadow. Immediately, I was afraid, but thought that perhaps it was my father having a late-night cigarette. I called for him, and there was no answer. The thing in the chair just sat there, completely still. It took a moment, but I eventually realised that I could see the orange glow of the streetlight through whatever was sitting in that chair. I remember thinking I was dreaming, remembering the dream I'd had a few months before, and being a dumb kid, I tried pinching myself, but obviously nothing happened. I remember the adrenaline and the cold chills. I was frightened of this thing, whatever it was, so I bolted for the stairs. From there, I could see into the living room, and I looked once more and saw this shadow thing standing from the chair and moving forward. It looked and moved like a man, except for the fact it was semi-see-through. I remember I took the rest of the stairs at a run and spilled most of my water down myself. I looked in on my brother, and he was still there. I stood at the top of the stairs and listened, eventually hearing my father cough from inside his bedroom. I knew then for sure that thing was neither another male in the house. I ended up sharing my brother's room that night. He offered no resistance, seeing that I was in a bit of a state, but I never spoke of what I saw. I guess over time I just didn't think about this anymore. Maybe I convinced myself that I imagined the whole thing. But this past summer, I had another dream. The first time in over 15 years. It was a waking dream of sorts. I was in bed at about 5 a.m, and what I recall most vividly was the sun streaming through the window and filling the room. I remember flopping my head to the side and staring at my bedroom door. And it was there. This huge shadow figure that was as tall as my bedroom door. I could see the outline of a head, shoulders, a torso, arms, but absolutely no features. Again, just black. And once again, I could see the bedroom door through it, as though it was not entirely solid. I'll never forget the feeling of my heart leaping into my mouth at seeing this thing, and I shot up in bed and screamed. I literally screamed the house down. Cue frantic scrabbling and pounding from the next room, and my dad charges in, finding me hyperventilating in bed. "What? Dream?" I remember he asked. He was clutching his hunting knife. I agreed and sank back into bed, but after the shock wore off, I started recalling the experiences of year prior. I can't deny it caused discomfort, but I dismissed it as just a dream and even joked in the following days about waking the whole house. It was maybe 3 weeks later, and I was home alone. It was maybe 11 p.m. to midnight. I'd gone to the kitchen for some reason and was standing over the sink. I looked up and caught my reflection in the kitchen window. I had the lights on. It was dark outside, and it was clear as day. Behind me, as I was by the sink, was a tall, lanky shadow figure. Again, I saw a head, shoulders, arms. I have chills right now just recalling this one. It's fresh. I know it was no dream and no far-off memory. I turned around, and there was absolutely nothing behind me. I glanced back at the window, and it was still there, reflected behind me. So I ran. I charged through the hall, up the stairs and into my room. My intent was to grab my phone and call someone to come home. I remember so vividly that as I reached for my phone off the vanity, the loudest, deepest growling sound I've ever heard seemed to come from the upstairs hallway outside my room. I know it's not a brave or cool thing to admit, but I dove into the closet at that point and hid. It was about half an hour or more before I felt brave enough to come out and turn the lights on. Although I got comfort when people returned to the house, I couldn't sleep and began thinking of the previous dreams, the figure I'd seen so many years before in the living room. What if this was somehow connected? Years ago, probably about 2 decades, I had just moved from Calgary, Alberta, to a small town in northern Alberta, probably about an hour from the capital, Edmonton. The reason for the move was that my grandpa was sick with cancer and had a stroke. So my mother, younger brother, and myself moved the 4 hours to be with him and my grandma. We're going to move into the basement. I was about 6 at the time, and my younger brother was 5. My grandma is upper middle class in Canada, so her house is nice. Probably around 70 years old at the time of this story. Things were sort of odd off the bat. Getting lost in the house, foggy memories I would have, this uncomfortable feeling if I was ever alone in a room. A couple weeks into staying there, I would have restless nights. My younger brother and I shared a room, and there were always these shadows that stood beside us. The shadow had an uncanny resemblance to Anubis, though I wouldn't have had this revelation until much later when I was older and happened upon the image of Anubis. I would have just dismissed these things as imagination and that it was dark, except my brother had these same experiences. Now that was creepy, but what happened next took the cake in my book. Adjacent to our room was my grandma's cold room. It was connected to the laundry room and is where she put the cat litter. Also in this room was a grand piano. We weren't allowed to touch it or go into the cold room because we could hurt ourselves. One night, while the adults were upstairs and the same with the cat, we were downstairs beside each other, in bed, when we heard piano notes come from the room beside us. Instantly, our breath caught in our throats and we immediately bristled. It only played 3 notes and never did that again. I'm atheist and don't believe in ghosts, but all of my life experiences I've ever been in, this creeped out. My brother tells the exact same story as well. Ever since that time, all the creepy feelings in that house disappeared. I haven't had another experience like this. Just thought I'd share. Since my mum and dad are divorced, I live in 2 separate homes at any given time. While my mom tends to find places that are well cared for and in decent condition, my dad often invests in the bottom of the barrel. Back in about 3rd grade or so, my dad and I had moved into a 2-story house in a pretty friendly neighbourhood. We knew some of the neighbours and all, but the house we had always seemed off. A lot of the time I felt uncomfortable or unsafe. I'd cry a lot when I had to sleep, since I felt so vulnerable being in my room alone. So given my fears, I'd often sleep on the couch since our living room was close to the front door. Unfortunately, there was one night when my fear of sleeping in my room was completely abandoned, since I saw something I decided was worse. It didn't look particularly scary, but the vibe it gave was enough to scare me away. Standing with arms slightly raised from its sides, stood a completely black figure in the archway of the kitchen. It looked like cardboard cut out almost. No texture and no visible depth. Just black. Empty. I was horrified, obviously, so I ran off to my room and ended up sleeping there. The second spirit in the house, though, was never threatening. It always seemed to be a father figure, almost given I've always had strained connections with my dad. The spirit was definitely a man, looking to be in his 20s or early 30s at the latest. He never really gave me a horrible vibe, just the occasional accidental spook when I saw him in reflections. He'd look over my shoulder while I played with toys and sit in one of our chairs in the living room where I saw his reflection on our TV. He'd always been so warm and inviting. Part of me really wants to go back to that old house and confront what horrified me, but it'd be hard to explain to my skeptic dad. Recently, some things have made me remember experiences from my childhood. When I was around 6, my mom and I moved to Cuernavaca, Mexico. Think heavily forested. It rains heavily half the year. We moved into an old house and a lot of strange things happened. The first big thing was I saw what I believe is an angel. I was standing with my mom looking at the yard we had just finished cleaning, and by a fountain I saw a blonde angel. It was wearing white robes, but I didn't see wings. They might have been folded back, but it was beautiful and with bright light all around it. I couldn't tell its gender, but it was looking at the fountain with its hand out, as if it was reaching for it. I looked at my mom, and she was looking the opposite way. When I looked back, I just saw the back of the angel's robes as it was walking around the back of the house. I didn't tell anyone, and shortly after, stories of ghost sightings were being heard around the town. A couple of weeks later, I was sleeping and I awoke, feeling a bit frightened. I heard a soft voice that sounded like a woman, and it said, "Do you want me to help you?" I got freaked out and went under the covers and fell asleep. One afternoon, after waking up from a nap, I opened my eyes to see my mom staring back at me with a pale face. I asked her what was wrong, and she just said, "Alex, are you okay?" And I replied, "Yes." It wasn't until later she told me I had woken up once before with my eyes bloodshot, and that I had begun growling at her and scrunched my hands as if I had claws. Of course, I didn't remember waking up before, and my eyes were clear. The last thing I remember is on the TV one morning, there were strange symbols written on the dust of the screen. They looked like words, but in a different language, not like any I've seen, so that was strange. After these events, my mom took me to a lady who tons of people visit every day. She doesn't charge anything, and she's like an oracle, I suppose. My mom asked her about me, and she just said I had a lot of light. Then she took me to a witch, and she did some ritual and lit herbs and chanted some things I don't remember. She had me lay on her lap and told me to close my eyes. She told me to open them on command, and when I did, everything was normal, but there was a green tint to everything, like wearing sunglasses with green lenses. Then when I blinked, everything was back to normal. If one saw green, it had a meaning, but I forgot what the lady said. I had this experience probably around 7 or 8 years ago, but I still recall it in great detail. Myself and some friends had been at a wedding party and decided around 2 or 3 a.m. that we would like to have a wander around so that my friend could smoke a spliff away from the main guests. Being local, I said that I knew of a place a couple of minutes away that would be a nice place to sit and have a couple of beers and a smoke. The place I mention is a very large oak tree in the middle of a nearby field. As it was a full moon and clear sky, it was still fairly light out. As we approached the field, I stopped dead and told everyone to be quiet, as I clearly saw a human-like figure by the oak tree. Being so late at night and far from houses, I didn't expect to see anyone around. All my friends told me I was seeing things, and after looking again, I too believed that maybe I had just seen a shadow or something. I stepped over the gate and into the field, but as I got closer to the tree, I then saw this large figure appear to stand up from the ground and stare in our direction. It seemed to be around 6 or 7 feet tall, wearing a long trench coat and large brimmed hat, and was all black like a silhouette. This time, my friends had also seen it, and as it started to calmly and massively quickly walk towards us, we all sprinted back towards the steps we had first come down. The one time I looked back, I estimate that the figure had gained around twice the distance we covered, running as fast as possible, whilst appearing to walk very calmly and never run. Once we got back to the road, it was clear that it had stopped following us, but we stayed in the area for around an hour to see who it was, and nobody ever came up the stairs. I'm convinced this was something supernatural, and was hoping some people on here may be able to shed some light on the matter. This experience I had still frightens me to this day. It frightens me for the reason that I don't know if it really happened or it was just my imagination. It was about 3 or 4 years ago. I live in an old neighborhood in Chicago. Not the downtown area, but a modest working class area with very old brick homes that mostly have not been updated in a very, very long time. One of the few areas that have not been remodeled or touched in decades. One night a couple of years back, I went to sleep rather early. It was a Saturday night in the summer. Not many people were outside due to the fact that there isn't much of a nightlife in my neighbourhood. A few hours passed of pleasant sleep, but then I woke up. There were no loud sounds, nothing out of the ordinary. I just woke up. As I laid in my bed, I got an urge that I've never felt before. I got up, got dressed, and went outside. I had no idea what I was doing out there. It almost felt like something was perfectly right about me doing this, but I had no control that I was. When I got to my doorstep, I noticed the streetlight that was directly in front of my house was dim. I was surprised, so I looked to my right to see if all the streetlights were like this. As I looked left down my block, I noticed the street was lowered and a giant tunnel entrance was right in the middle of the street. It was about 10 feet tall and made from brick. It looked incredibly old and rusty. Usually, I'm not a curious person, but it felt right to go in this tunnel. As I walked closer, I noticed a giant pool. It stretched back into the tunnel and made a right turn down a corner. The pool was completely lit up underneath and shined bright. I looked around and didn't see anyone. There were no lights on in any of the houses, and it was dead quiet. I decided to venture in. I climbed into the pool that was roughly 4 feet deep, so I could easily walk or swim if I wished to. I decided to walk just so I could see what's ahead. I followed the pool path, and after a few minutes of walking, I saw ahead of me an exit. It was exactly like the entrance I came through. I got out of the pool and walked forward out of the tunnel. When I got out of the exit, I looked around and I saw nothing but trees surrounding this old brick road I was standing on. I looked straight ahead where the road went, and there was a massive building. It looked almost like a banquet hall, but old. There were streamers and flags all across it, almost like an old circus would have. It was completely dark out, except for the lights shining through the windows. I continued down the road and got closer to the building. I slowly went around the side to a bunch of old wooden crates and looked in. There was a massive event going on inside. It looked like a ball or some kind of social for a town. The music was nothing I've ever heard before or since, almost like a classical country mix. Then suddenly, I got that urge again that everything felt right, like I was being controlled. I decided to walk in through this door near the crates. As I entered, everything froze. The music was still going, but every single person froze in their step. All at once. Every person in there turned around and was staring at me like I don't belong at all. I'll never forget the blank, hollow expressions on their faces, almost a look of caution for me. That exact moment, I felt like I got a grip on reality and what was happening. I backed away slowly, but then I went on a full sprint through the doors and down the road into the tunnel, and lunged into the pool and swam all the way back. I quickly got out of the pool and dashed out of the exit. What I saw next almost made me black out. The tunnel was gone. There was nothing there. All the streetlights were back on and houses had lights on. Still feeling uncomfortable, I ran back into my house and sat on my bed. I must have blacked out due to the fatigue and anxiety. The next morning, I woke up and was laying in bed thinking to myself, what a horrible dream. After a few minutes, I decided to get up. That's when I noticed my shoes were on, my clothes were still on, and my bed was soaking wet. I'll never forget that moment. I'm still in shock. I don't know if it was a dream or what. So it might sound bizarre, but when I was 17, I moved to a different country to attend the school there. The St. Anne de Bellevue was a small little city near Montreal, with a giant McGill U campus next to it. Really nothing special about the city, aside from the huge-ass lake. So I was extremely lonely and vulnerable at the time. My whole life got turned upside down, and added bitchy students and my social anxiety, and you got a social kid with depression. Later, around late October, I started to get paranoid that someone is always next to me and following me around. I would walk down the street and feel a burning gaze on me, and it would make me turn around and anxiously look around. The haunting feeling never left me. When I was home, I still felt the presence. I started hearing unexplainable noises from upstairs, even though I lived on the last floor. Constant thumping and creaking noises. I felt a presence in the darkest corner of my room, as if something was there and looking at me. The dark figure with no shape or form, but still chilling and feelable. Thought I was getting crazy. Even contacted my aunt, who's a doctor, and asked her, am I going crazy if I'm paranoid 24/7? She said, you might just be under great stress. So I shrugged it off. Fast forward to March. I was already so drained, the feeling never left, and I kept feeling the gaze and the presence. Being Muslim, there were no mosques nearby for me to visit and pray, so I just kept chanting Bismillah to keep myself sane and safe, like my dad always taught. He said whenever you're scared to talk to God, He'll protect you. So I did. In March, it was the 5th month of me being paranoid and terrified of my own shadow, and I felt extremely suicidal and depressed. I didn't feel the joy of life anymore. Constant issues within myself only made it worse. I somehow managed to get through the last 2 months of terrible school and made it out. I got back home and was so relieved, but the feeling never left. It only got worse, and I actually started feeling physical touches from it. When I lay down, it laid down on me. Whenever I pass the mirror, I feel I see something there. I kept hearing unexplainable sounds and things moving and creaking. I slept with the Quran next to me every single night. It came to the point where I couldn't even sleep properly, feeling the gaze on me. I kept getting deeper into my depression and felt even more numb than before. I kept seeing it, the shapeless something in the darkest corner. It was dark and scary, radiating terror. I never felt so alone and helpless. One night, I was scrolling through Wikipedia on my computer, and then something caught my attention. There was something next to me, staring right at me, and it almost made my heart stop. That's when I decided it needed to stop. Before that, unfortunately, I made a lot of mistakes. I keep saying to myself that it was depression, but now I feel like I was just scared of everything. I resigned from university and went to my grandparents. I stayed at their home for quite some time. I decided that I no longer want to keep it in me, so I told my other aunt about the strange occurrences. Unlike my parents, she trusted me. Being from a country with a strong religion before Islam, we still have people who practice shamanism. My aunt contacted her and told her our situation, and the lady was kind enough to meet us at her apartment. Some people might say she's fake and a charlatan, but she never charged us anything, and saying that it's her duty to help people in need, and I do believe that she has some powers we cannot fathom. She made a ritual, put a candle next to me, and instructed me to close my eyes and not to open them until she finished. She proceeded to chant prayers and gently tapped and hit me with her ritual stick made out of animal hoof, leather ropes and wood. The candle went wild. The fire was raging and the smoke went completely black. When she was over, I turned around and saw that more than half a candle was already burned and wax pulled on the plate. She said that I'm followed by a demon that fed off my misery. She said it always latches onto the most miserable and desperate people who are alone and vulnerable, and they drive them crazy until the body gives up. She told us to buy a small lead ball or ingot, and we did that. Upon returning, she redid the ritual with prayers and fire. She kept praying and chanting. The shaman heated and led until it liquefied, and when she was nearing the end of the ritual, she threw hot liquefied lead into the footpan full of icy cold water. She did it all standing next to me while I was afraid of lead falling on me and me getting burned. Fortunately, I was spared the burns and pain. The shaman then proceeded to take out the solidified lead out of the water, and when she showed the form of it, it gave me chills. It looked like an ugly face with little horns or something sticking out of it. Out of the safety issues, she never let me take a picture of it. She explained to me what it was and what it needed from me, and then carefully wrapped it in multiple layers of tissues, fabric, and plastic bags. The lady said we should find a place where no one will ever find this thing and dig a hole to seal it in there. So we went to the big dumpster that's been in the city for so long and dug a hole big and deep enough to fit the lead form in. She advised us to bathe in salted water to purify the body and clean the negative energy. And here I am, a couple of years later, completely free of worries and paranoid thoughts. I'd say it was a quick recovery, since I was paranoid as a leftover habit. But the first night after the exorcism was the calmest night in a long time. Believe it or not, but I just wanted to share it somewhere, and maybe it will be helpful to some people and interesting to others. So my older brother and I were talking tonight, and it brought up some old memories of their old haunted farmhouse. Just a little background about us. I met my brother and my two older stepsisters when I was 11 at a county fair my mom took me and my sisters I lived in all my life to. She threw these three other siblings on me all at once and told me my father, sperm donor as I like to call him, had 3 kids through a previous marriage. While the first weekend I went to stay with them after a few weeks of going to their house, as a way to help me bond with them better. My 2 older sisters I had lived with came with me, because they became friends with the other part of the family I'd never met before, to help me feel better about staying the night with them. Well, my older brother and I were staying up late bonding for the first time over our love of baseball games on the PS1. So we were playing the PS1 with both doors to his bedroom open, just in case the girls wanted to come in and switch out to give one of us a break from playing the game. We started noticing the doors in this old farmhouse closing, so we just thought that the girls were up playing around at 1 a.m. All of a sudden, we heard someone run down the steps at full speed. One of his bedroom doors was right next to the staircase, and we didn't see anyone come down the stairs, so we just brushed it off, thinking maybe we were just hearing things, until the PS1 shut down all by itself. So we turned it back on and went back to playing the game, only this time using cheat codes to turn the baseball players' heads into pencil heads. Later on that night, we hear the fridge open and a jar of jelly come crashing against what we thought was the floor. We go into the kitchen and there's glass and jelly all over the wall directly next to the fridge. So we start looking all over, trying to find the culprit. We wound up cleaning up the mess and going back to the room to play our game. Maybe 30 minutes later, we see his basketball in his bedroom start wobbling in a circular motion. Then all of a sudden, stop, and you can hear footsteps running up the stairs. We chased the sound all the way up to the room where all 4 of our sisters were dead asleep. Still gives me nightmares to this day. Back in January 1995, while driving home on leave, I experienced something straight out of a movie. I was getting ready to be deployed to Gitmo for a joint task force mission and needed my parents to take care of 2 kittens I'd adopted a few months earlier. The drive home would usually take around 6 to 7 hours, but I didn't mind the drive. Anyone who's ever driven through Texas knows that you can drive for quite a while and not see another car on the road. So it's about 9 p.m. and I'm about 15 minutes outside of Seymour, Texas, heading towards Dallas. The 2 cats that for the most part had taken up residence on my back section by the rear window had been sleeping. It was here that things started to get strange. I noticed about 200 plus meters behind me another vehicle's headlights and thought nothing of it. A few moments later, the cats both started making this moaning noise over and over again. I figured they needed to go to the restroom, so I pulled over. So I'm in the middle of nowhere with these 2 cats freezing because it's January, waiting for them to do their business. After about 5 minutes and a cigarette, I decided to put them back in the car and give them a little dry food. I began heading back down the road. So 10 minutes go by and I see headlights again behind me, possibly a little closer than before. Both cats jump up to the rear window and start making their noises again. It's here where I realised that the car behind me earlier never passed me while I was stopped. I started to slow down to let the vehicle pass me, but after going over a hill, the headlights vanished and no car ever drove by. I went through another small town and stopped to stretch my legs. It would have been around 10 p.m. now, and I wouldn't have much longer to go. I started back on the 2-lane interstate and was moving along around 70 miles an hour. Sure enough, about 10 minutes out of the town, the lights returned. This time, I said screw it and stepped on the gas. As I approached the bridge, heading into the next town, I blew past a police car. He of course turned around and lit me up. I pulled over and rolled down my window, showed him my driver's license, military ID, and badge. He asked me what the hurry was, but seemed distracted while he stood next to my car. He kept looking up at the sky. I told him that for the past hour, I was being followed, and that no matter what I did, the vehicle behind me just kept pace. He let me off with a warning and told me to take a right at the flashing stoplight and cut through town. He said that he would stop the next car to come through and check them out. He also mentioned that they were receiving multiple claims from nearby residents of weird lights in the sky and noises. I thanked him and did as he suggested, and didn't have any other issues the remainder of my trip home. If anyone else has had a similar incident, I'd love to hear about it. This story takes place in Texas back in the fall of 1994. I was traveling from a small town outside Dallas called Grapevine and was heading to my duty station in Lubbock, Texas. I would never take this route again after what happened this night along I-20. I was traveling alone and had left around 7 p.m. on my road trip across Texas. If you've ever been to Texas, then you know that you can drive for hours on end and still be in Texas. Anyways, this story takes place about 30 minutes outside Abilene and would change my life forever. I decided to stop at a rest stop along the highway to stretch my legs and take a piss. I noticed a woman in a late 70s model Ford parked in the lot when I got out. I went and did my business, had a smoke, and before I left, I noticed the woman was sitting in her car. So I walked over and knocked on the window, which startled her, and asked if she was okay or needed help. She smiled and said that her tire was flat and that her battery had died while she was waiting here. I asked if she had a spare tire, and she said no. I asked if anyone was coming to get her. She said that her daughter was supposed to, but it's been several hours of her waiting. I asked her where she was going, and she said Abilene. So I offered to give her a ride if she wanted. She started crying and said that would be wonderful. So we started heading to Abilene and making small talk. I told her I was in the Air Force and heading to Lubbock. She said that was wonderful and hoped that I really enjoyed it. I did notice that she kept looking in the mirror, so I asked if she was okay with me giving her a ride. She smiled and said that everything was fine. She was just happy that someone stopped. So we finally got to her house in a small suburb just outside of town. She thanks me for a ride and hands me a scrap of paper with her home number on it. She asked that I call her when I got to my destination so she can know I made it safely. I thanked her and said I would. But I'd wait until the morning, since I knew it would be late when I arrived in Lubbock. I arrived at Reese Air Force Base late that night and stayed on the base hotel. I got checked in and took a shower and went to bed. The next morning, I got up and got dressed for the day and went to find my unit HQ. I didn't even think about the night before. I had so much to do checking squares away. It wouldn't be for another 2 weeks before I came across that scrap of paper with the number. I felt bad that I hadn't kept my promise to call, so I decided to stop what I was doing and give her a call. I called the number, and a young woman answered the phone, so I asked for Sandy. The woman on the line said, "Who?" So I apologized and said maybe it was Sandra. She asked who this was, and I gave her my name and explained that I had given her a ride a couple of weeks back. She said that I must be confused, and I read the number off the paper in my hand just in case I dialed the wrong number. She said no, I had the correct number, but I couldn't give her mother a ride because she passed away in the early 80s. She was apparently driving home and began having car troubles, so she stopped at a rest stop just outside of town. When she didn't make it home, her father became concerned. It was at that time there was a knock on their door, and two state troopers and a local police officer were at the door. She said that a trooper saw the vehicle stopped at the rest stop and stopped to check it out. What he found and what she told me gave me chills. Her mother had been brutally raped and her head was bashed in. Someone had slit her tires and disconnected a battery. The worst part was that she didn't die right away, as there were bloody handprints on the window, steering wheel, and shifter, like she was trying to leave. The troopers said they didn't have any suspects, but there were times that certain motorcycle clubs would pass through at night. I described the car and what her mother looked like, and what she was wearing as best as I could recall. She definitely didn't look old enough to have a daughter my age. Her daughter just started crying and asked that I not call back. A few days later, I received word to report to the squadron commander, so I headed over to the building. When I arrived, my captain called me into his office and began asking questions about where I lived and when I drove in and what route I took. I immediately knew something was wrong. We then went into a briefing room where my CO and a Texas Ranger and state trooper were seated. I introduced myself and took a seat. They began by asking the same questions my captain had previously asked, and why I had called the number and spoke with the woman. I explained everything as clearly and in detail as possible. They then finished taking notes, and the ranger asked who needed a smoke. So my CO excused himself, and the captain, two more officers, and myself stepped out back to the smoking area. This was when the ranger informed me that he was the trooper who had found the car back in the early 80s, and that was the only reason he came out today, was because of the details I mentioned in my phone call to the daughter. The trooper said that they got calls about a stranded woman every so often, but when they get there, they never find anything. So in closing, be careful who you decide to help, because not everyone is what they seem. So back in the early 90s, we lived in this house attached to the back of a general store. The house and store were pretty old, maybe early 1900s or late 1800s. Out in the store, there was a cellar that originally was used to store goods back in the day. When my parents bought the shop, the cellar collapsed and we couldn't access it anymore. Local historians said the town used to use the cellar as a holding room for the undertakers back in the early 1900s because it was cool. So on to the story. The house and shop were always cold. I never felt alone in that house, and I would have been 4 or 5 at the time. I distinctly remember waking up one night and an old lady in a yellow dress, who I'd never met, was sitting on the bed opposite mine. I remember hiding under the blankets and calling out for my parents, and when they came, the lady was gone. I never spoke to them about it until I was a lot older. My mother also had 2 encounters with this lady in yellow, which I found out about later on in life. My mother isn't the kind of person who would make up stories for attention, or embellish them. She recalled once seeing a lady in yellow standing at the end of our long hallway, who watched her do the housework. She stood at the end of the hall for 10 or 15 minutes before disappearing. This was before I'd ever mentioned the lady in yellow sitting on the bed in my room. The other time she had an interaction with the lady in yellow was something she said she would never forget. Another woman, we'll call her Sharon, had begun hanging around our family, trying to court my father. I don't know the details of how far she got. My parents ended up divorced anyway. So Sharon had been hanging around, family friend and all that. And one day, my mother confronted her about everything in our lounge room. They argued, and my mother asked her to leave, opening the front door and telling her to get out. As Sharon went to leave, she stopped and turned to abuse my mother once more before she left. Now, my mum said that as Sharon raised her finger to point at her, there was a massive gust of wind that came from inside the house and a flash of yellow. Next thing she knew, Sharon was laying on the ground outside the house, and that something had pushed her over backwards out the door. She said Sharon was as white as a sheet, got up, and ran off without saying anything. My mother and I were the only people in the family that ever saw the lady in yellow. My father lived there for years after the divorce and said he never saw anything and that we were making stuff up. My brother never saw anything either. I like to think that my mum and I are connected to the lady somehow. Maybe we have a gift, or maybe she only shows herself to some people. For some backstory, my father died in February of this year for reasons that can be simplified as the results of years of debilitating alcohol addiction. I have two older sisters, and out of all of us, I can say for certain that I've had the most difficult relationship with my dad. His alcoholism didn't get really bad until the late 2000s, when a number of compounding factors likely led him to drinking more intensely. The recent loss of his mother, my older sisters growing up and moving out, him getting his position in his job changed due to a very unsatisfying one, and the compounding financial trouble he's always had with regards to my mom's lack of employment benefits. This coincided with the latter half of middle school for me and my entire high school life. So for most of my adolescence, I only knew him as this deeply despondent man who seemed to have nothing to live for. While my sisters were able to grow up and move out, I didn't have such an opportunity and had to bear the brunt of his neglect. Flash forward to September, and my mom makes an appointment with a psychic that we've seen before, for similar reasons. We want to assess the spiritual state of the family and give us some advice going forward. Me, my mom, and my sisters all arrive sequentially to the home where she does her work. The first thing she notices when starting her session is that she felt a very heavy feeling of apology in the room, and that whatever was causing this seemingly walked into the room before we even arrived. She distinctly wanted to point out this feeling of apology towards each individual person in the room. This alone wasn't really noteworthy, but then she started being able to bring up details that were pertinent to his death, like a strong aroma of alcohol and seeing blood clotting within someone's body. She was also able to bring up the fact that he was found deceased by my mother, down to the exact detail of being able to sense that she stopped momentarily before opening the door, having a strong instinctual feeling that he was dead. But what really got to me was that in elaborating on this apologetic mood, she sensed that these emotions were directed towards me in particular. She made it a point to emphasize that this feeling of apology was directed towards me the most, out of everyone in the room. Even my mom. At this point, the unemotional daze I was in for the beginning of the session went away, and I nearly broke down sobbing on the floor, but I was able to control myself before that happened. I still don't believe she was 100% accurate with what she was telling me, as it comes with human error and the ambiguousness involved in the messages she receives. But I'm most certain that was real. That had to have been my dad in some form, and it completely matches the apologetic personality he had in his life. Let me start off by explaining that I have a fear of mirrors. Sure, as kids, my cousins and I would dare each other to go and lock ourselves in a completely dark bathroom and chant Bloody Mary 3 times in the mirror to see if she would appear and eat our souls out through our eye sockets, as I'm sure many of us kids did. However, that's not where my fear of mirrors started. It was when my mother hung a large golden framed mirror in the hallway of my childhood home. It was gifted to her after a family member passed away, and quickly became one of her favourite pieces in our home. Myself, on the other hand, absolutely hated it. It gave me the creeps, with the way the strange designs on the gold frame formed in malicious-looking faces. My mother just laughed at my overactive imagination when I commented to her about it. Then when I would sit to watch TV in our lounge area, I could see the mirror from my peripheral vision. I always felt an angry stare coming from the reflective glass. Most of the time, I brushed this off until the shadows started appearing. At first, this too was only from my peripheral view, that I would see what looked like a shadow figure darting across the glass. That changed late one evening when I was watching cartoons from the lounge room couch and I heard my name whispered. I just knew it was coming from the mirror as my heart sank to my stomach and every hair on my body just stood up. I slowly turned to look down the hallway when I caught a glimpse of someone or something glaring at me through the mirror. In a split second of me wanting to run and scream, I watched the mirror suddenly drop and hit the hardwood floor beneath it with a loud thud. I was too shocked to say anything as I heard my mother's rushed footsteps coming down the hall and her gasp when she saw her prized heirloom laying on the floor. "What happened?" she asked as she knelt to pick it up. "Did you do this?" she demanded in a tone that she only used when she was truly angry. "No, I didn't. There was something there. It just fell." I felt my cheeks burn hot as I stumbled over my words. My mother's tone stayed stern as she explained there was no one else home, but she and I, and how she had my father check multiple times to be sure the mirror was securely hung on the wall. "Objects do not just jump off walls," she exclaimed as she held the mirror out from her to inspect the damage. I was surprised to see the only damage to the mirror was a jagged crack right down the center of the glass. My mother took the large mirror under her arm as best as she could as she walked down the hallway, mumbling about getting it repaired soon. My mother stored the wrench mirror away in a supply closet, and I was grounded for the evening for lying about a serious incident. While I was angry for being grounded for something I didn't do, I was more relieved that I'd not have to look in or at that stupid thing for a while. Not long after the incident, my father accepted a promotion at his job, which required us to move away from my childhood home. We moved into our new home a couple of towns over, and I never saw the mirror again, nor did I dare to ask about it. While my mirror phobia stuck with me, I never had any more actual creepy experiences with mirrors. Well, at least not until 3 months ago. Life was great 3 months ago. My husband and I purchased our first home, and we had finally settled in. I could not wait to show my mother just how much of her interior decorating skills I inherited. She came down one evening, and we had the best time. I gave her the grand tour, then we reminisced over coffee on the enclosed porch. As the sun began to hide behind the mountains, I walked my mother to her vehicle, and she had quite a drive home and work early the next morning. "I cannot believe I almost forgot," my mother half shouted as she excitedly tore open her backseat driver's side door. Before I could ask what she was talking about, she pulled out a large package that was wrapped in sky blue shiny wrapping paper. There's no way I could not give my baby girl her first housewarming gift. She grinned while rubbing her hands together. "Go on, open it," she laughed. I smiled at her as I gripped the beautiful paper and began tearing it to shreds. Just as I was telling my mom this was not necessary, I stopped mid-sentence. My eyes locked on the person staring up at me with a shocked expression. It was as if time had frozen as I realized the person staring back into my soul, looking dumbfounded, was my own reflection. My own reflection encased by an all too familiar, creepy golden frame. "Do you remember it? Oh, you just loved it as a kid, and it's time to pass this beautiful piece on." I heard my mum's voice bring me back into reality. Yeah, I remember it." I fumbled over my words, as confusion burned like acid deep into my brain. Did she not remember? How did she forget how much I hated this mirror? Where did she find it? Where was the once very noticeable crack going down the center? "Oh, darling, this mirror would be so beautiful in your entryway. You know, right over the side table you showed me." All I could do was smile and force a nod. As confused as I was, I didn't want to hurt my mother's feelings, especially given how excited she was. "I'm afraid I've got to run," my mom started as she slid into the driver's seat of a car. But do send me pictures when you get it hung up, okay? Love you bunches, baby girl. I'm so proud of you. With that, she blew me a kiss and was gone. I stood out in the almost completely dark outdoors, completely bewildered. I had no idea what horrific events awaited me in the weeks to come, as I dreadfully carried cursed looking glass into my home. I stood over the stove, frying bacon with my mind reeling, when I heard the front door open and shut. "Honey, I'm home," I heard my husband Mark call out. I glanced at the kitchen clock, right at 10 p.m. Mark had been working late, and that meant late dinners for us. "What is this?" I heard Mark ask as I entered the entryway of our home. I saw Mark holding the large mirror in his hands, looking at it with such curiosity. My stomach tightened and I felt bile rising in the back of my throat. "Nothing. Ready to eat? Breakfast for dinner?" I said, doing my best to seem normal and not like I was going to vomit. Sure smells good," he grinned. "But I know you. What's up? Why dodging questions about the mysterious mirror?" I felt my fake smile drop. All evening, I considered what to do with this stupid thing. I had settled on smashing it to pieces in the backyard and burning the shattered remains until my mother texted me, reminding me to send her pictures of it on display in our home. So, it sat on the tile floor. Leaned against the side table, my mother had mentioned hanging it above. As much as I hated to admit it, she was right. It was the best place for it. "Mom, came by," I started nonchalantly. "It's a housewarming gift." I shrugged and headed back to the kitchen to plate our meals. "Your mom couldn't just write your name on a gift tag like a normal person," Mark chuckled. I turned to see him standing in the kitchen, a large creepy mirror in tow. "What?" I asked, still feeling just as confused as I had since my mother's visit ended. "She wrote your name on the mirror with, like, her finger or something." He started looking at the glass with an odd expression. "Huh?" I said, as I stomped over to see what he was talking about. Just when I thought the knot in my gut couldn't get any bigger, there it was. Carly, written across the mirror in what did appear to be finger smudges. I felt all the blood in my body drain out of me. There was nothing there just a few hours ago. I stared at that thing forever before I brought it in the house. The glass was flawless, not a smudge or spot in sight. Even the aforementioned crack was gone. "Babe, you good? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mark's voice brought me out of my trance-like state, the confusion engraved in his expression. "You know, Mom, always doing weird stuff like that." I tried to laugh it off. "Come on, let's eat," I said, as I grabbed our loaded plates and headed to the living room. I heard Mark set the mirror down on the kitchen floor before following behind me. "Carrie, what's going on?" His voice was serious now. I felt his touch on my shoulder as he turned me to look at him after I set our plates on the coffee table. I felt the tears burn as they started to fall from my eyes. "I'm just stressed. I'm trying to work from home and nothing is going right. The internet is still spotty. My boss isn't happy. I've missed 2 deadlines during this move. It's just stress," I said, as I wiped away the few tears that had escaped. It wasn't that I didn't trust Mark. I truly trusted him with my life. There was just some part of me that was not ready to open up about this whole dilemma. I just couldn't. Not now. Not yet. Mark pulled me into a tight hug. A hug that, before tonight, felt like it could have sold anything. "I'll call the internet provider first thing tomorrow," he promised, before giving me a peck on the head. After eating and watching a couple episodes of our favourite show, we headed to bed where Mark was out cold before his head hit the pillow. It took me much longer than usual to sleep. As I drifted off, I could have sworn I heard, "Soon, Carly," whispered in my ear by a raspy voice. That night, I dreamt of a dark room. I was cold, alone, and scared. The strong smell of sulphur burned my nose and eyes. "Help me!" cried a strange foreign voice. "Help me, Carly!" "No!" I screamed out, as I sat up straight in bed. My head was pounding, my heart was racing, and I was drenched in sweat. Babe? Mark's groggy voice came over me like a warm blanket. It's okay. Just a dream, he said as he pulled me into him. My mouth was so dry that it felt like I had sand in my throat. I just need a drink, I managed to croak out as I pulled away and stood on my shaking legs. Mark offered to go down with me, but I shook my head no and headed to the kitchen. I just needed a minute to calm down, and a Diet Coke. As I entered the kitchen, my body came to a complete stop when my eyes fell on the mirror. I had forgotten Mark had left it in there, on the floor, leaned against the cabinets. I slowly approached it. I wanted to kick it, to throw it, anything to get rid of this wicked thing. Instead, my eyes were drawn to the fact my reflection wasn't clear, like a film was over the glass. I felt myself drop to my knees, slowly crawling over to the mirror to get a closer look. My blood ran cold. The entire glass was covered in handprints. I jerked back from the mirror as I heard footsteps approach me from behind. I nearly fell out of my skin when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I shrieked, just as I looked up to realize it was Mark. Jeez, Carrie, he yelled as he jumped a bit in response to my scream. What's wrong with you? The mirror, I practically cried. Look, someone touched it. Mark looked over towards the mirror with scowl. How do you know someone touched it? Look at the handprints. They're too small to be yours, and I haven't touched it. Someone is here, Mark. I found myself starting to cry again. Mark looked back to the mirror and squinted his eyes. What handprints? The ones on the... I felt my sentence trail off as I looked back at the mirror. It couldn't be. The mirror was spotless again. Not a single imperfection in sight. Mark was silent as he looked back down at me. It wasn't until this moment I realized I was still sitting on the kitchen floor. They were here, Mark. And what about my name? It's gone. You saw it too. I wiped it off with my sleeve before I sat it on the floor earlier, Mark said, looking at me in a way I had never seen him look at me before. Almost like he was looking at a complete stranger. I'm sorry. I just had a nightmare and must have psyched myself out, I mumbled as I looked down. I felt absolutely insane. Come on, Mark said, as he reached for my arms to help lift me off the kitchen floor. Let's get you to bed. He swept me up into a fireman's carry. I felt myself relax a bit against him as he carried me. As he turned to head to the bedroom, I couldn't resist the urge to look back at the mirror one last time. I couldn't be sure, but I could have sworn I caught just a glimpse of someone in the mirror. Actually, not just someone. It looked like my own reflection, staring at me with a blank expression, before vanishing completely. My parents found a 2-bedroom house with a large kitchen, dining area, living room, TV room, and even a sunroom for a little over a couple hundred a month rent. This was a steal, even back in the early 90s. My mom was pregnant with me, and my parents were anxious to get out of the tiny apartment they were living in. Of course, they jumped on this and moved in as quickly as possible. Right away, my mother started experiencing weird phenomena around the house. A cliche feeling like you're being watched, never feeling alone even when you were alone, things you could brush off. This quickly picked up into things that weren't so easy to pass off. Such as one day, not long after moving in, my mom had a couple family members over showing them the house. They were in what was to be my room. Since I was not born yet, my closet was pretty empty, and my parents had stored completely emptied boxes into my closet until they could get a truck to haul them away. My closet was a walk-in closet. Small one, but still plenty of room to stack 2 rows of boxes and completely shut the door, and the boxes be at least 6 or 7 inches away from the door. As my mom was talking to her visitors in this room, their conversation was completely cut off, as the closet door flew open and just about every single one of those boxes came flying out of the closet, scattering all over the floor. Mind you, these were completely empty cardboard boxes. Even if they had somehow managed to fall against the door, there's no way they could have opened the door with such force. My mom told me it was as if someone was in the closet standing behind the rows of boxes and hit them with superhuman strength. My mom said that they were all pale as ghosts, speechless, and pretty much ran out of the room after this. Things continued to escalate after that day. My room never truly was my room due to me being absolutely terrified of it. It appeared that the activity in the house stemmed from my room, and it all started with that first encounter. When I was a kid, my family moved into this old house. Some odd but harmless stuff happened, like hearing footsteps on the hardwood floors. But after we were there longer, something similar to my brother's story happened. I was 13, and it had been the last day of school, and I was having a sleepover. It was me, my oldest best friend, and 3 friends from my school. When it was bedtime, my best friend, let's call her Fran, and one of the 3 friends, we'll call her Sarah, slept upstairs in my bedroom, and me and the other 2 slept in a bedroom downstairs. The next morning, Fran and Sarah were wide-eyed as they asked me if I was all right. I told them I was fine and asked why they were asking like that. They told me that before they could fall asleep, they suddenly heard my parents yelling at me and crying. They said it was all loud and clear. They were sure they had heard me specifically crying on the stairs, but it never happened. Me and the other girls had gone to sleep without incident. Fran and Sarah swore up and down that they were not joking. Then later that summer, Fran was sleeping over, as she frequently did. We were inseparable as kids, and we were part of each other's family. We had decided to sleep in the downstairs bedroom. We were lying in bed and talking about whatever when we heard the front door open. We hear my brother Danny and my cousin Jake talking as their door closes. It was odd, because they were both living in another state, but we figured they were in town to visit. We hear them come in, talking about raising the kitchen as they loudly go up the stairs. We thought nothing of it really and went to sleep. The next morning, we expect to see one or both of them, but we don't. No car in the driveway, no suitcases anywhere. So we ask my mom where they are, and she has no idea what we're talking about. They hadn't come. They were in another state.